Unfortunately, as I'm sure everyone here, I'm kind of preaching to the choir, everyone is aware that housing policy has gone very, very wrong. But I'm going to hopefully sound a positive note in terms of where the current government is moving towards and where we might be able to carve out some space for the types of ideas we'll be discussing over the weekend. So just as an overview, I'm going to really flesh out the consequences really of our failing housing system, then look a little bit into, from a shelter point of view, why we think this is happening, then talk a little bit about the government's response to the issues arising out of the financial crisis, specifically the focus on home ownership, and then hopefully have some positive note to end on. I know with a lot of these talks, everyone tries to end on a positive note, which can be quite difficult when the situation is so bad. So, speaking of a situation that's very bad, this is going to be no surprise to anyone, but it's interesting just to see some data. House prices have obviously raced away from average earnings. So this is the median house price divided by median earnings, and you can see that it's over 9 times. So median house price is almost 9.5 times. Can you hear me? Okay. Hello? Oh, wow. Okay, that's better. So I don't know if this is obviously not working. Oh, okay. I'm actually a punk singer as well, so I'm more used to this kind of stuff. So the house prices to earnings, scarily, is also above the pre-crisis peak. So it's bigger now than in the boom years. And I think what's really striking about the other graph is you can see that rents are really racing away from that pre-crisis peak as well. So as much as the focus is on priced out young people, it's obviously people in the private rented sector that are suffering too, and this is something I'm really going through now. So credit constraints, though, following the financial crisis have definitely priced out young people. The average age of a first-time buyer seems to be ever increasing, and this has really been the thing that has terrified government and really informed their policy. It's the absolute collapse in home ownership by young people. But it's important to note that mortgaged home ownership, so not people who already own their home and have paid off their debt or were able to buy in cash, has been dropping since the early 90s, which hints that there is something more systemic going on than just a financial crisis story. But the effect of all those priced out young people has been to put ever-increasing pressure on the private rented sector. So it's really changed the nature of, so up until very recently, the kind of mainstream narrative has been that the private rented sector is for students and young professionals, and they're quite happy to have rubbish conditions and short tenancies because they're not going to be there for very long. But this increasing pressure has meant that we're seeing higher and higher percentages of families being housed in the private rented sector, and they obviously have very different needs. The discussion around the private rented sector has changed a lot as well. So there's been a real acknowledgement in mainstream narratives as well that high rents and poor conditions in the private rented sector is causing younger people to put off things that everyone goes through, so getting married, having children, and we did some research recently that really emphasised that. When I say younger people, I mean under 45s, which is kind of like this ever-increasing definition of what it is to settle down almost. And even the business community is acknowledging that they are struggling to attract talent, so-called talent, in high-pressure areas like London and Oxford, because there's nowhere for people to live. Ooh. But for all this talk of young professionals priced out of the ownership market, the housing crisis is really a story of housing haves and have-nots. There's some really interesting research published by the Resolution Foundation over the summer that showed that the people who've borne the brunt of the crisis are really those on low incomes and middle incomes. So this graph on the left shows you the proportion of a household income that's being spent on housing. And you can see, so they've classified people in terms of their income band. And you can see, whilst everyone's has gone up, the explosion has really happened, not only in low and middle income households, but in people who are dependent on benefits to pay for their housing or pay for any other expense for that matter. And you can see that higher income households pay less. They always have done, and it looks like they always will do at the moment. It's also important to note as well that it is definitely a story of owners versus renters, and this is true all over the country more or less. It's not just a London thing, it's not just a Southeast thing. And you'll probably hear me say those words quite often through this presentation, as it's something quite frustrating. People like to characterize the housing crisis as just a Southern thing, because that's where we see the most extreme end of it. But yeah, so this shows that you can see the private renters, yellow dots, which is the most recent data, more or less in general above the equivalent for owning with a mortgage. And what's also quite striking is costs to the proportion that social renters are spending on housing has also gone up dramatically. And that's because of numerous different policy changes as well. So the human impact of this is obviously really serious. Housing undoubtedly is contributing to poverty, and high housing costs are undoubtedly contributing to homelessness. So the pink line on the graph on the left shows poverty rates in England and how they're changing before you take into account people's housing costs. Okay, thanks. And you can see the red line's much higher. And the graph on the right shows that so when you look at the reasons why people are becoming homeless, the ending of a tenancy in the private rented sector is now the dominant reason. We've managed to reduce, for various different reasons, all other causes like relationships breaking down. But the end of a private rented sector is now the thing that's really driving homelessness. And this just shows just how devastating that can be for families who are ending up in temporary accommodation. Really, really heartbreaking. It's just one of the many stories, unfortunately, that we hear at Shelter for people struggling and finding themselves in that situation. So I've got a very short amount of time left, so I'm just going to kind of touch upon some key points about why it's happening. So one of the things that's clear is that we've failed to build enough homes for years, and this is the responsibility of several governments. It unfortunately cuts across the political spectrum, and you can see that what's happened is really public house building has completely fallen away, and we've been left to the private rented sector, the private development sector. And the problem with this is it really operates on a boom-bust cycle. So every time there's a bust, housing supply really ratchets down and never really recovers. And that's happened in every single housing market crash. So this is because the development sector is really based on a speculative model of building. I'm not going to go into too much detail. Maybe we can discuss this more in the Q&A. But the point is that developers buy land and then they're essentially gambling that house prices will increase in the future in order for them to make a profit. And the problem is that they basically what they pay for land is essentially what they assume the increase in house prices will be. So you get a lot of intense competition in the land market, and you get a feeding through of the secondary ownership market into land prices. And that's why it's really difficult for anyone else that wants to do any other business model to buy land. So this just shows that housing is really driven by the land market. You can see the blue line, and it's a really, really volatile market, even more volatile than house prices. So the blue line is land prices, and the pink line is house prices. And I guess that's why so many of the themes coming out through this weekend are really about land ownership. So what is driving that demand for housing? So Demand is really driven by how much, not only is by how much people can pay for it, so that's why the financial sector is so important, and it's also driven by what people want it for. So that's why housing as an investment is a really important concept when we're thinking about why, if housing supply is so low, prices do crash every now and then. So what happens is on the up, when prices are rising, everyone wants to cash in, and everyone wants to use cheap credit to cash in and realise those capital gains from land or housing. And when we think about people who are speculating on land and housing, we think about people like buy-to-let landlords. And that's undoubtedly true, that at the moment, because everyone else can't afford a mortgage, buy-to-let mortgages are really driving the expansion in mortgages. We also think of these foreign investors buying up safety deposit boxes in the sky around the River Thames. But the sad fact is that we're all bought into this. The very concept of a housing ladder is that you get yourself an asset, you get yourself property, you hope for an increase in price that you can then leverage into a bigger house for you and your family in a nicer area. Another element to this as well is that people will use housing to gain access to credit. And with the pulling back of the welfare state, more and more we're reliant on housing as a way to fund ourselves, either in old age or in periods of illness. So the government's response to the credit crunch was really to reinflate house prices. I think that's kind of been relatively widely acknowledged. And they did this through schemes like Help to Buy and Help to Buy Equity, which was very much focused on new build properties. And the excuse was that meant that it was focused on increasing supply. But unfortunately, their own analysis showed that over half of people who used the scheme could have bought something similar anyway, and all it really did was mean that people could pay more for the house that they were buying. So that essentially threw these speculative developers a lifeline and meant that they could keep that speculative business model going. Another really serious issue is that we no longer, as it stands, fund low-rent housing in this country. And when I say low-rent housing, I don't mean really low rents, I mean 80% market rent, which I think most people will have experienced as not really that affordable anyway. So the Corporate Spending Review in 2015 represented a really big reallocation of funds towards shared ownership. And although it was a genuine increase in housing investment, 2.3 billion of that is going on starter homes, which as it stands is defined as a home that is sold at 20% discount on the market price. Now, unfortunately, if the market price is really high, a 20% discount doesn't really get you anywhere. And some of our previous analysis has said even if we assume that starter homes are really small and really cheap, they're likely to be unaffordable for 60% of young private renters in England. And that's really high in high-pressure areas like London and the southeast. We've got some new research coming out as well that unfortunately shows that with prices so high, even shared ownership, where you only buy a quarter of a house and rent on the rest of it, is unlikely to be affordable for a third of renting households, even if they're working. But that brings up the question, what about those people who aren't? What about the people who are dependent on those benefits, who are facing such high housing costs? What about people on low and middle incomes? What about people who will never be able to get a mortgage? Alongside this, we've seen the austerity narrative really driving cuts to housing benefits, because housing benefits with rising rents are making up an increasing share of our welfare bill. So we've had the bedroom tax, but we've also had the introduction of local housing allowance, which is going to be frozen until 2019. And we've also got the benefit cap, where overall benefits are going to be capped for non-working families. As well as a really serious removal of housing support for young people. And this shows how devastating that is going to be. There's a real crisis brewing for households that are dependent on that support. The red areas are places where local housing allowance will not cover the rent on a two-bed flat. So this is by 2020. people who are in that situation will literally have nowhere to go. The graph on the right as well just shows how many people, in how many areas people are going to be hit by the overall benefit cap as well. So we do have a real crisis. As bad as it is now, we have an even worse potential crisis in homelessness and destitution brewing. But we also have a new government. So at Shelter, we like to take an optimistic view. And all these new faces, so Theresa May and Gavin Barwell, who's the new Minister for Housing, Sajid Javid, who's the new Secretary of State for the DCLG, have all kind of been starting to give hints that they may be moving away from the ownership narrative. There's some acknowledgement that we might have to build other tenures, which is great. And there's also some acknowledgement of this really destructive, speculative business model that we've been building houses with. But of course, the issue is if they're willing to intervene in the housing, land and development market, the real question is who are they intervening for? They are committed to building 1 million homes by 2020, which has driven this idea that rental homes are going to be a key part of it. But I think our fight now is to carve out space in the mainstream discussion that really makes that argument that if we're going to build rental homes, they need to be affordable for people on middle and low incomes. And we've got some new research that will be published next week, hopefully aiming to influence the autumn statement, hopefully aiming to get that funding back into low-rent social housing, that shows that even the 80% market rent is not going to be affordable. So we need to persuade the government to fund some other kind of low-rent social housing. So we're looking forwards now to the autumn statement, which is on the 23rd of November, and also a white paper on housing that the government is hoping to publish. They say later on in this year, but things are getting pushed back a lot, probably the Brexit effects, so maybe December, January. And that is, for anyone who's interested in influencing housing policy, those will be kind of key things to push for and influence on. So yeah, that was a massive information dump. Thank you very much for listening, and yeah, I look forward to the Q&A.